I'm Todd, and I was naughty. I did everything wrong. I got kicked out of art school, I drank heavily, and I looked to other religions and versions of spirituality to get fulfilled. The problem was, I was in the occult and I didn't even know it. My life was a wreck, and I had to learn what it meant to have a relationship with Jesus.
And I'm Laura. I was super nice. I did everything right. I got saved young, went to Moody Bible Institute, got married, and followed the Christian rules to having a good life. Problem was, that formula didn't work. I had to change how I related with Jesus.
At the end of the day, what I learned is the very simple truth. Jesus is the answer, and the only one that will ever actually fulfill you.
Naughty versus nice.
And welcome back to Naughty versus Nice. Of course, I am Todd.
And I'm Laura.
And with us always is my lovely wife, Kelly.
Hello.
So we are doing a divorce series, and we're talking about some pretty serious subjects. We're talking about marriage. We're talking about divorce. We're talking about what that looks like in a biblical context. And you just talked about your situation and how you got to where you're at, how you've gotten to some of the conclusions of where you're at least the catalog, like the event that kind of started absolutely everything for you. And one of the things that we like to do with the show is throughout the middle of the week, Kelly will kind of dig up some questions and give us an opportunity to maybe expand on some of the ideas that we've talked about, or kind of maybe clear up some ideas, or even just generally answer some questions that people might have. And so that's what I think we're going to take care of there. We're kind of do today.
All right.
There we go.
So in your story, I hate the word story. Mm-hmm. We're going to say experience because it happened. This isn't something you wrote down on a paper like a novel.
Yeah.
This was your life. So in your experience, what he was unraveled and started coming out, and everybody had to play catch up to what was going on. So why do you think it's so hard to see emotional abuse? Or why do you think it's so hard for everybody to want to see it and to admit it's there?
Well, one thing is, in our current culture, it's been magnified in situations that I wouldn't consider it to be what it is. It's kind of like false reports from women of, assault in certain situations. It unfortunately, when people over-exaggerate or react to something that baseline isn't what they're saying it is, it discredits those who are saying it. So the question is why it's so hard to see emotional abuse in the church, particularly?
Sure.
Okay. I think from my own experience, the churches that I had been in tended to foster, probably unintentionally, that the role of the wife was the supporter, the helper, fixer in the family. And there was very much this idea, like I remember it being advice, when your husband gets home, you need to give him a half hour to, settle down from being at work, and you just hold the fort down even longer. And absolutely. And I'm not saying you can't do that, but it was just this idea that you were there to serve him. Your purpose and identity now became to serve him. And so under that umbrella, as that kind of gets reinforced year after year, and there's this pressure to maintain good relationships and have a successful marriage, I think you stop looking for it, and it's subtle. I don't know. Does that answer your question, or is that not detailed enough? I don't know.
No, it does. I just have noticed you work with women in extreme cases of abuse in marriage, physical, emotional, spiritual, sexual. I tend to work with young women growing up in homes like that. So it's weird how I just realized our ministries kind of they're like end caps for each other. But it's been my experience, and I know we've talked about it before, is when you're sharing somebody's experience or trying to get somebody who's a peripheral player to understand what is going on, there's that almost that was an instance, that was a bad day at work, that was this. There's all these write-offs of each individual thing, and people don't want to back up and see the pattern. And so I've had experiences, working with the peripheral people and trying to talk to them where the responses were so extreme, but both positionally were the same in what they did for their churches as, pastor, pastor's wife, elders, whatnot. But then I would get, well, that would never happen to me. I wouldn't allow that. all the way to watching somebody start to crumble in front of me because they missed it in their own congregation, and asking, how do I not miss this again? And willing to take in every resource we can offer to learn and educate. So why the two extremes? Why we're so against it in some cases, and then so like, okay, I'm willing to learn. Is it just personal? Is it we haven't experienced something personally before, and until we do, we're not willing to learn about it? Or
I think that's in there because I remember, this is the dumbest story, but when the kids were little, my middle son tripped on the stairs, and I was like, oh, I'm sorry, But then later the same day I tripped too, and I was like, oh, wow, I have a lot more empathy now. And it's like you really can't, and nobody can experience everything for someone else. But I think what those both sides could seek is people who have had the experience and try to relate as much as possible. And then when they encounter those situations in their churches, draw on somebody who's had the experience. That's not really your question. I know. I think it's just so much more layered. It is generational. It's experience. It's pride. I don't want to let go of the picture of marriage. I don't want to ever think it could be me. A number of people over the years have said things like, I would have not frozen. I would have fought back. I would have left as soon as he said something. I would have known and seen it. And don't say that. It's crushing. I've usually hold it together until I'm in private, and then I'm very, very, very hurt, and they don't realize it. But just thinking it through more, maybe spending some more time reading materials, spend time with victims. Do not treat victims like victims. Treat them as prophets. I think Diane Langberg says that. They're telling you something very important that you need to hear, and you're missing it if you don't pay attention.
I think that it's very easy to miss something that you don't have personal experience with. It's, for example, apparently a fat camp just jumped into my head. It's easy to be like, oh, you're lazy because you're overweight. You don't exercise enough. It's somehow it's on you. Whereas, what if it's a thyroid condition or something along those lines? I don't know why that was the example that jumped in my head. My whole point is, if you have a high metabolism, it's not something you have to worry about, and you don't have to go hit the gym all the time. You're not going to be as sympathetic to somebody who that's a lifelong struggle or a situation for them. Whereas all of a sudden you get stricken with a thyroid condition and you're eating nothing but salads, and next thing you know, you've got to go up 5 pant sizes. All of a sudden you're like, oh, I was probably a little bit unreasonable, a little bit hard on this situation. I have a wider view now. And that's kind of what we're talking about is there are two ways to achieve a wider view. There is to have the experience and have your world opened up in that way. And I'm not talking a positive way necessarily. Sometimes it's negative. But there's also being observant, seeing what's going on around you, recognizing what's happening in the nature of life, getting educated on a subject, being aware, being able to identify what those things are, and then just understanding that's also part of how things are. And just because you aren't personally affected by it doesn't mean it's not devastating to another person, because I can identify with that. I know what it's like to be completely crushed on something. I wasn't crushed in that way, but I know what it feels like to have your entire world turned upside down and not know which end is up, okay? I might not know what it's like to whatever that uniqueness of that situation is, but that's a way to connect. We're not doing that anymore. We're not searching that part out of ourselves anymore. We're looking at the surface level, the surface thing, because going any deeper is too painful. It's too difficult. And once again, like I'm saying over and over again, if there is a second God in church, it's comfort. And it needs to stop. We need to start looking at and recognizing, look, who did Jesus give, mad props to in Revelation in the 7 churches? It was the ones being persecuted, the ones that weren't comfortable, the ones going through a hard time. He was very supportive. It was all the other ones that had comfort, that had wealth, that had all their needs taken care of, that were putting Christ second. He was like, you guys got some work to do. So why don't we see it? Why do we take it too far in one area and not another? If you have somebody in church and church leadership that's gone through a difficult time or a different struggle, and they can relate immediately, they can identify it, and they can see it right away, they're going to see it, and they'll, and we do see instances of that. But most people in positions of authority and leadership and inside that environment have to present a perfect life, have to show that they've got it together, have to be stable for everybody else. So they push down, they deny, they don't acknowledge what's going on in their own lives, and it creates a barrier for them to be able to see it, recognize, and acknowledge it when it's going on in somebody else's, because if they do, now all of a sudden they're in a position where they got to look at their own life and go, whoa, that means my life, that means this situation going on in my life, it's wrong, and I need to address it. But I can't address it because I have to show that my life is correct and I'm doing it right. I'm godding right, or whatever. So I think there's multiple layers to all of this, and it gets difficult and it gets challenging, and layer on top of that, regionally the differences, nationally differences in nations, how it shows up and expressed. But humans have that thing, fortunately, where we're all kind of the same in that way. We have the ability to look at one thing and pay attention to it and ignore the other when we probably should be. I don't know if that tidied that up nicely or not.
Tidy.
Maybe.
Thanks.
I don't know. Maybe I should have ended it before where I was like,
well, and I had an additional, it's a weird side note too, but having said that sometimes people say things to you when you've been through something that are insensitive, I think there is still a responsibility on people who have experienced hard things to remember that not everybody has. So I lost my mom. She died over 20 years ago. None of my friends have lost a parent. That's just what it is. I don't then get mad at you because you have your parents. You have to have, both sides need to exercise grace, that not everybody can know exactly what you're going through, and there's just a need to sometimes just accept that. I don't know if that's off topic too much, but
no, I think that works. I think yeah.
If nothing else, we're rambling.
You're welcome. All right. In your experience that you just shared, some of the responses of the church were for you to stay in the position. One of the things, we've all heard in many instances that, Todd, you've mentioned, is nothing has happened yet. Mm-hmm. That is a form of spiritual abuse. You are using your authority to encourage somebody to put themselves in danger, to stay in danger, maybe even keep their kids in a dangerous situation. So how do we spot spiritual abuse? Like, how do we spot it when somebody's using God and the Bible to particularly abuse somebody intentionally? Your situation, it was more accidental. They thought they were interpreting the biblical passages on divorce in the correct way. They were encouraging you to save your marriage, so to speak. I'm talking about the intentional, somebody using scripture to cause harm, to control, to manipulate, to dominate. How do we spot that?
I'm remembering that I think Todd sent a video to our group chat this week, the fog.
Yeah.
I think that you look for, if your reaction to someone in authority who you suspect is using their authority poorly is involved in spiritual abuse, are you responding or feeling fear, obligation, or guilt? And so I think of all the different things that were said to me in an effort to kind of motivate me to stay in. It kind of fell in those three categories: is fear, obligation, or guilt.
I think that's a good point. It's also good to think of that in how we react to people. Just saying, the reaction before from the last question, like, well, that would never happen to me. Well, you're now creating guilt and shame in the person in front of you. So is what we're about to say, are we having a reaction to somebody who needs grace and empathy from us actually going to cause them fear, obligation, or guilt? Mm-hmm. Or are we going to reach them on a one-to-one level?
Well, I think one of the standards is, and you were pointing it out, Kelly, and it's important to point it out, there's a difference between somebody clumsily engaging in spiritual abuse, but they mean to do good, versus somebody intentionally trying to harm. You can have that fog, that fear, obligation, and guilt response in both. But if somebody's intentionally trying to be that way, you're going to have it more often than not. It's that 10,000-foot view pullback. It's not the instant, or it's the instance that we're looking at. We're looking at that pattern of behavior. Every time you go to that elder in your church, and you have an issue, you have a question, you have something going on in your life, and you need guidance, you need something, and out of the last 10 times, 9 times, you've walked away with fear, obligation, or guilt, that person's abusing you spiritually. That pattern's established. If out of the 10 times, 1 time, okay, that's just, people have off days. People give bad advice. People mean well, and they are clumsy with their words, and it elicited a fear, obligation, or guilt response in you. That's not what we're talking about. You want to look at that whole picture. Can you tell when somebody's abusing you spiritually the first time it happens? Only if you've got a lot of experience with it, because you've got other people as templates by which you're overlaying over this person and over this interaction. And even then it's difficult to tell because you still don't have a baseline. But after 2 years, if every single interaction you have with this person, or 70% or 80% of the interactions you have with them, you're walking away with fear, obligation, or guilt as being you're somehow insufficient, that's one of the ways that you know it's not accidental. It's likely intentional, and likely and definitely a person that should not be in leadership. And I would say that there's a whole nother can of worms that goes with that, of calling it to attention, having your examples cited, marked down, cataloging everything, and being able to present a case. And
we're dealing in a very ideal scenario where we're this almost objective person, and we walk in and that person, oh, I feel fear, obligation, or guilt. These scenarios are built slowly with grooming. I hate that people overuse that word because it's a real thing, that you slowly get pulled in to relationships where you can't see it. The most effective ones are the most insidious, and some people don't know it. I mean, some people are just, this is what they grew up with, this is who they are, so they're not planning it out at night. And we think it's so black and white like that. I still look back on the 15 years of marriage and go, what was happening right there? I don't see it black and white. I still think I'm to blame for things that I know logically I'm not. So you are so pulled into it so emotionally, it is very, very difficult to see it. And so that's why I think it gets overlooked, is because we're all participating in it and not realizing it at times, that kind of a thing. It's an environment usually. It's a home, but there's probably a family behind that spouse who agrees with them, or a church behind that spouse that agrees with them. It's just an overwhelming culture of it sometimes.
Well, and that's just it. It's the abuse, especially psychological abuse or emotional abuse. It's not showing up the way that we might think it would. I'll give you an example. The idea of, and once again, 1 in 9 men are in abusive relationships in religious households, okay? So this isn't just a phenomenon only for women, but it shows up differently for men. So an example, the guy comes home from work, walks in the door, takes that extra second, pauses, sucks in, and is trying to gauge the room. Is he about to get yelled at for something that it's coming out of left field? Is he about to get showered with praise? Is he about to get told they're disappointed in him? Is he about to be told he's insufficient in some way? What's about to happen? It's that moment where they take, and you see it. You see the physical moment that happens where they suck in and they're trying to gauge what's going on. And in an instant, they're trying to make an evaluation of what they're about to walk into. That's a sign. That's a sign that something's not right in that household. And, that's a guy who's going through some kind of, abuse. If he had a rough day and he's sucking in and taking that moment because he's got to interact with a bunch of people and he's got to do the rest of his day, that's a different story. It looks different. Every single time, something's going on there, and it's those subtle signs, those subtle things that maybe you don't notice. You don't even see it going on, but it's there. It's that underlying thing.
It's you don't know what you're coming home to.
You had mentioned that, yeah.
Yes.
That's an alcoholic
an alcoholic parent. Yeah.
Yes. It was always when my dad walked in the door, there was that pause. Mm-hmm. What are we getting today? Are we getting the fun dad that throws us in the air? Are we getting drunk dad? Is he angry? Did he have a bad day at work? But it just made me, as you were saying that, think about that. That's what I grew up in. You and I have been married for a while now. We have bad days at work. But when we come home, I never have to question what I'm going to get from you. You come in the door and it's like, hey, how was your day? I'd be like, man, today was a rough one, Kel. I couldn't get my head together. I was under deadline. The creativity was not flowing. That's it. There's not that worry or concern or that moment of what's he going to be like if the day was bad. It's the same. You're just you. You just share what was bad about it or good about it, but there's not going to be fear, obligation, guilt, or that I'm going to receive from it.
I'm not taking anything out on you.
Well,
Yes.
in addition to adding to the component, because you and I have similar upbringings, it just looked different. It's what's called a dry alcoholic. So somebody who acts like one who isn't.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that was my mom. So my personality and your personality are very different. So growing up, we're both being conditioned by similar situations. You come home, is there going to be an angry person? Is this person going to have killed themselves? Is this, all of that. You have to assess the room. I still assess people, moods, atmospheres that way. It's why I'm exhausted by being with people after a while, because I'm measuring it all the time. It never did get shut off. I mean, I know it's there. I work with it, whatever, blah, blah, blah. But by my personality, by that natural, like, please other people, whatever, I took those things in, and then I brought that into a partnership and marriage, and then it became very easy to be in that role and be abused. And so it's just that subtle, like it's same situations, and then you end up, you don't walk out and you're like, I don't know, what is your phrase?
I do what I want.
Yeah, that's it. That's the one. Circling back, this is back, I don't know, 10 topics ago. The example for the grooming and the slow, the boiling frog in the water is the Rabbi Zacharias. We've all listened to a couple of different podcasts detailing the things that happened. Each of the relationships he had with women started out very friendly, complimentary, or taking care of them provisionally, and it was friendship for a while. And then it became a little bit something more, and a little bit something more, and a little pressure, and then they feel an obligation because he's created a relationship where he took care of them and inspired their trust and respect. Then it would develop into a complete relationship, and of course she felt guilty. And if she approached, I've heard this in several different cases, they approach the abuser and they say, I don't want to do this anymore, this seems wrong. And they say, but the health of the church is going to suffer if you cut off this relationship. That's more than once said by different people who've been accused of these things. So that's just...
And it moves into fear.
And usually the women who were targeted were vulnerable and somehow groomed in their upbringing, just like we were talking about. Just some parts of their personalities. I think people who have ill intent know how to find people who will receive it pretty well. And that's not my fault. It's just they're bad people and they're looking for...
No, it's not to
innocent.
blame. It's not to blame them for it. It's you have an abusive parent, you get conformed into the type of person that becomes abused. So I had an abusive parent, but it showed up differently. It was different than both of your situations. And one of the ways that showed up is that I became a people pleaser. So you were willing to put yourself aside or ignore red flags or ignore things that you shouldn't be ignoring, because what matters is making sure that you're there to get kicked around or you're there to be harmed. I couldn't tell you, there's a number of situations I walked into it knowing I was about to be harmed, but I did it anyways. You get programmed, and I still have a responsibility in that. It's not like it's not my fault, but it's also not my fault. It's like both happening at the same time. You have to be willing to recognize it, so then you can start taking responsibility for it, so then you can make adjustments in order to prevent that overriding code that's in the back of your head running your operation system. You got to hack that code, and you got to write new code in there. It's one of the examples I use when I talk to people, is try to frame it as like operational system software and stuff. I have a responsibility to myself to make sure that I do what I can in order to interrupt that code, write new code, so that way I don't get harmed that way in the future. But I also have an additional responsibility to make sure I don't go harming other people that way too, because you learn how to be. People that are abused and harmed, especially when they're kids, not only do they learn to become victims, but they also learn how to become abusers. And there's a line between that somehow. I don't know where it's at, but it's something like I was talking to somebody about it one time, and I was saying, look, I don't know what the magic number is, but you'll go through a cycle and you'll abuse others. There will be a time when eventually it becomes permanent. The number of cycles you run through, the code becomes permanent. You get ingrained with it. Then you become the abuser. You'll still be a victim at a certain point, but that abuser takes over the personality in a way. and that becomes the way you interact with others in the world around you, and you won't notice that you won't see it anymore for what it is. You'll be like, I'll never become an abuser, when you're a kid, but then you become the abuser. It's the pattern of it. It's the cycle of it. It's how it works. That's not everybody. That's not everyone in every situation. But talking about this whole thing and bringing it all full circle again, if you're not willing to look at and acknowledge what's actually there and see what it is, as painful as it is, as hard as it is, as difficult as it is, that code will run and you'll go through the cycles, and eventually it will become a permanent part of who you are, and there won't be anything. There's a point of no return. You'll be what you don't want to be. You have to confront it. You have to face what is going on. You have to see your marriage for what it is. You have to recognize your relationship with your parents is what it is. You have to recognize you're doing to your girlfriend or boyfriend what you're doing in order to hack that code, interrupt the process, and try to get on a path to change it into a different trajectory.
I don't know how to wrap this up, so.
Was that too much?
No, I thought it was good. This is a serious subject, and it is something that's full circle, and that we have to understand how we are wired, what we will naturally see, what our personalities will naturally tend towards, and be able to stop it or hack the code, but also see in others where this stuff is coming up. It's a very deep subject. It's a very important subject. And I think it's something that just really needs to be talked about more in, are we self-reflecting, and are we studying the Bible? Are we learning what that's supposed to, like, the truth? Mm-hmm. So there's just a lot of moving pieces. And we're human.
Well, I think one of the other issues is it becomes theoretical at a certain point. Somebody watches 30 seconds of TikTok, and all of a sudden they become a behavioral expert, and they know everything there is to know about narcissism. They know everything there is to know about alcoholism or abuse or whatever it is. I did the research, guys. I have like 2 minutes and 35 seconds of videos underneath my belt. I basically know everything. It's like, no, you don't. It's great to watch those videos. It's great to get the information. It's great to read books. It's good to do all that, and we're advocating that you do that. Okay, I don't want to sound like we're not. Definitely get educated. Definitely, but there's also another side of it where when you experience it, when you can see it for what it is, and you live it, it becomes personal. It becomes offensive. It becomes, I don't know, something else. I think that's one of the ways that we're all talking about this subject. It is personally offensive to me that these things exist, and that they need to be addressed, but they need to, and so, I don't know. I'm probably just rambling right now.
On that note, I think we're done with this bonus mini.
Yay! It's uplifting and bright once again.
Dream crushing.
Dream crushing. Yes, it is. All right. Thank you guys for listening. Next week, Laura will follow up with her second part of the divorce series, going into biblical divorce and what the Bible actually says about it. Woohoo! Thank you guys for listening. Bye-bye.